SABC News Reporter Khayelihle Khumalo, who's at the Union Buildings in Pretoria. Good afternoon. Over to you.
Well, certainly, Julia, it's a very historic and a very unprecedented working visit, a first one since the establishment of the Ukrainian states, but also undoubtedly the issue that dominated is around the peace process in Ukraine since 2022, the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And we know that President Ramaphosa and so many other African leaders and so many world leaders, really, they have been focused in making sure that there's a lasting solution. But really, to look at the highlights here, we're joined by the SABC's international editor, Sophie Mokoena. But Sophie, I would imagine that phone call between President Ramaphosa and the US President Trump, and we do know what has been happening between Pretoria and Washington in terms of the tension, the expulsion of our ambassador. Let's look at the significance of this, especially on such a very critical day.
I think quite an important moment when you look at the fact that only yesterday President Trump was furious because he suggested that both parties, that is Russia and Ukraine, must agree that there will be gains and losses. And the issue of Crimea and other areas in terms of losing territory, both sides, was a thorny one in London, where you had these stakeholders, America, the European Union, and others meeting to try and find a solution. But it is this call where the president also spoke to President Trump about this issue of a peace process, and starting from just issues related to South Africa, I'm told that it was very, very cordial. And even the invitation that President Ramaphosa must visit Washington or the United States of America, that speaks to a different tone to what we are used to when we see the Twitter. But many South Africans have always been confident that if they can speak, the tone will be different, including him willing to get a better sense of the real situation in South Africa without being negative about the information that he got. And therefore, then to this one of a war in Ukraine, clearly President Trump wanted to be the leader in brokering peace between the two leaders, that is Putin and Zelenskyy. And now when you have an African leader being able to engage both leaders, you'd recall he spoke to President Vladimir Putin and then he spoke to Zelenskyy. And of course, it's Donald Trump. I mean, who is this president? He's the president of a small country in the southern tip of Africa, on the African continent, in the developing south. So this was actually a diplomatic coup for him this week with Putin, Trump, and Zelenskyy, and therefore that call was quite important. I'm told even an invitation to bring golfers to America when he's going there.
And of course, Sophie, by all means, it is a diplomatic coup. Key issue around the children in Ukraine that have been taken to Russia. We know that behind the scenes, South Africa also has been a very central player in terms of being a go-between, negotiating in terms of making sure that those children are brought back to Ukraine.
Well, the president of Ukraine commended South Africa in terms of the role the country has played in ensuring that some of the children are brought back to Ukraine, and you still have some. But the challenge here, according to the United Nations and UNICEF, it's the identification. It's going to be very problematic, but there's progress. And I think you'd recall that the International Criminal Court warrant of arrest against President Vladimir Putin revolves around the issue of the children. So if you are able to resolve that matter, who knows, you might see a situation where that might be rescinded. And therefore, come November, we may have President Putin on the shores, on our shores in South Africa, if things go well in terms of resolving this issue of children with the International Criminal Court. And now that Russia has got a better relationship with America, you can be able to deal with those issues. And that is why I'm saying this was a real diplomatic coup for the president in taking the matter forward, but also for President Zelenskyy to say, I agree to ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire. Now you have to go and convince President Vladimir Putin to agree to unconditional ceasefire. And a country like South Africa with good relations with Moscow can be able to do that, including now Moscow being a friend to Washington and Moscow listening to Washington. So you have a better chance to try and narrow the differences and the gap, and we may see that ceasefire. But also President Zelenskyy saying, when I ask him about who will be the guarantor, because if you are not having someone taking care of that process, you will see the two countries fighting again. He says it must be America, the European Union, and Africa, particularly a country like South Africa. So South Africa now is firmly on this international stage with countries believing and trusting South Africa. And therefore, I'm not surprised that President Putin would also, President Trump saw it fit to speak to President Ramaphosa just hours before this meeting. And therefore, this is a massive story, because they were also able to talk about the internal country-to-country dynamics. But I think for me, the big story is President Zelenskyy saying, I'm committed to ceasefire and cessation of hostilities unconditionally. Now get Russia to say that. If Russia can also agree to unconditional ceasefire, you will see progress.
Sophie, before we just wrap it up, bilateral relations between the two countries, we know that you spoke to the agriculture minister, talking about a very key sector for food security. We know about Ukraine and the Black Sea grain deal, a very key one here.
You know, the continent relies on, supply of grain in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Those two countries are really assisting countries on the continent. And you'd recall that when President visited Kyiv and Moscow with that contingent of leaders from Africa, the issue of grain was high on the agenda, and there was an agreement. Now we have the hub in Mombasa in Kenya, where this grain is being delivered, and then you get to deliver it to poorer countries. Therefore, the agriculture minister saying that much as South Africa this year it's expecting a bumper harvest, but the issue of agriculture is quite critical, particularly the fertilizers. But secondly, the issue of citrus fruits, because we are having challenges with the Americans, the market. So expand the market. You can have Ukraine as part of Eastern Europe, where you can sell your fruits and vegetables. And therefore, that's quite important in terms of trade and investment and issues of energy. You know, they are quite big on the nuclear energy, the Ukrainians and the Russians. They can help us build capacity in terms of nuclear energy, not war capability. And therefore, I think those are the important issues in terms of the two countries. But I think for me, the big story is the body language of Zelenskyy, him agreeing to certain things. And I think now South Africa, with good relations with Russia, it will be easy to communicate this message. And now Trump reaching out to President Ramaphosa. Let's see what's going to happen at the golf course in Mar-a-Lago.
Indeed, a very big acid test there. So with that, Juliet, back to you in Johannesburg.
Thanks very much. That was our reporter Khayelihle Khumalo chatting to the SABC International News editor Sophie Mokoena about that visit from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, meeting with President Cyril Ramaphosa. And of course, top of the agenda was those Russia-Ukraine relations, and Zelenskyy saying that he does agree to an unconditional ceasefire.